Racist flight attendant rips black woman's expensive dress, unaware she is a Supreme Court judge. When Supreme Court Justice Sarah Mitchell boarded her routine first-class flight, she never imagined her designer dress and quiet demeanor would spark a confrontation that would expose the ugly face of prejudice lurking behind polite smiles and pressed uniforms. As the plane climbed through the clouds, no one could have predicted how a flight attendant's discriminatory actions would force everyone aboard to confront an uncomfortable truth. How far have we really come in our journey toward equality? Let's stick around to find out. But before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today. If you enjoy this tale, don't forget to subscribe. Supreme Court Justice Sarah Mitchell stood before her full-length mirror, running her fingers along the delicate beadwork of her new designer dress. The garment, a masterpiece in midnight blue, had been a birthday gift from her closest friend, Maria. "Girl, you need to show them what a Supreme Court justice looks like these days," Maria had said with her characteristic laugh, pressing the elegantly wrapped box into Sarah's hands at her 50th birthday celebration last month. At 50, Sarah Mitchell had achieved what many considered impossible. As one of the few African-American women to serve on the Supreme Court, she had broken barriers and shattered expectations throughout her career. Her appointment 2 years ago had made headlines, but it was her groundbreaking decisions and unwavering commitment to justice that had truly defined her tenure. The dress fit perfectly, its sophisticated cut complementing her tall, dignified frame. Sarah smiled, remembering Maria's insistence on getting it. "You spend too much time in those judicial robes," her friend had teased. "It's time to remind the world that beneath that black robe is a woman who can turn heads." Checking her watch, Sarah gathered her briefcase, filled with case files for tomorrow's environmental hearing. The early morning sun cast long shadows across her bedroom as she prepared for another cross-country flight. After years of frequent travel, the routine was familiar. Briefcase, carry-on, passport, and boarding pass, all organized with the same precision she brought to her legal opinions. The drive to the airport was quiet, the streets of Washington, D.C., still drowsy in the early morning light. Sarah used the time to mentally review her schedule: a flight to San Francisco, an environmental law conference, and then back for crucial hearings later in the week. Her driver, James, had worked with her long enough to know she preferred silence during these morning rides, allowing her to prepare for the day ahead. Arriving at the airport, Sarah noticed the subtle shifts in people's expressions as she walked through the terminal. Some recognized her, their eyes widening in surprise or respect. Others simply saw a well-dressed black woman, their gazes lingering a moment too long on her designer dress and expensive luggage, making assumptions she'd grown accustomed to facing. At the first-class check-in counter, the young attendant's eyes flicked between Sarah's face and her government-issued ID, a barely perceptible hesitation that Sarah had encountered countless times before. "Is there a problem?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying the gentle authority that had become her trademark both in and out of the courtroom. "No problem at all, miss. Justice Mitchell," the attendant stammered, suddenly recognizing her passenger's title. Sarah maintained her composed smile, the same one she perfected over years of similar interactions. It was a smile that acknowledged the moment without escalating it, that spoke of understanding without accepting the underlying prejudice. As she made her way through security, Sarah noticed the usual mix of reactions. A TSA agent did a double-take at her credentials, while a young black girl nudged her mother and pointed excitedly. Sarah gave the child a warm smile, remembering her own childhood dreams of breaking barriers. The first-class lounge was a familiar sanctuary, but even here, Sarah felt the weight of being different. Among the predominantly white business travelers, she stood out in her elegant dress. Some passengers nodded in recognition, while others seemed to study her with barely concealed curiosity, as if trying to determine whether she belonged. Settling into a quiet corner with her briefcase, Sarah pulled out the environmental case files she needed to review. The case involved a small community fighting against corporate pollution, the kind of David versus Goliath battle that had always drawn her attention. As she read, she absently touched the beadwork on her dress, thinking about Maria's words. "You've earned your place at every table, Sarah," Maria had said while watching her try on the dress. Never let anyone make you feel otherwise. The words echoed in her mind as she caught another passenger's questioning glance. The boarding call came right as Sarah was deep in her review of precedent cases. Gathering her belongings with practiced efficiency, she moved toward the gate, her heels clicking purposefully against the terminal floor. The gate agent's eyes widened slightly at her first-class boarding pass, but Sarah had long ago learned to meet such reactions with dignified indifference. Standing in the priority boarding line, Sarah felt rather than saw the curious glances from other passengers. Her dress, elegant yet conservative, seemed to attract particular attention. She stood straight, her posture reflecting years of standing before the highest court in the land, her expression serene despite the familiar undercurrent of scrutiny. As she waited to board, Sarah thought about the countless times she'd made this journey, each flight a small testament to the progress she represented and the work still to be done. The dress, she realized, wasn't just Maria's gift, it was a symbol of how far she'd come and a reminder of the responsibility she carried. The gate agent called for first-class boarding, and Sarah stepped forward, ticket in hand. She could already feel that this flight would be different, though she couldn't say exactly why. Perhaps it was the way the flight attendant at the gate door looked at her dress, or maybe it was just instinct honed by years of navigating spaces where she was often the only person who looked like her. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped onto the jet bridge, ready for whatever the flight might bring. After all, she hadn't become a Supreme Court justice by backing down from challenges. As Maria always said, sometimes making a statement was as simple as being precisely who you are, exactly where you're meant to be. As Sarah Mitchell stepped onto the aircraft, the familiar scent of recycled air and leather seats greeted her. The first-class cabin gleamed under soft lighting, but something felt immediately different. Standing at the entrance was flight attendant Rebecca Watson, whose welcoming smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning," Sarah said politely, presenting her boarding pass. Rebecca's eyes narrowed slightly as she examined the ticket. "Could I see that again?" she asked, her tone carrying an edge that made several nearby passengers look up. "And your ID as well?" Sarah maintained her composure, though she noticed how Rebecca's gaze lingered disapprovingly on her midnight blue designer dress. This wasn't the first time she'd encountered such treatment, but something about Rebecca's demeanor suggested this wouldn't be a typical flight. "Is there a problem?" Sarah asked calmly, producing her government ID. No problem," Rebecca replied, her voice dripping with barely concealed disdain. "I just need to make absolutely sure you're in the right section." A few seats away, a young Asian woman in her mid-20s looked up from her phone, her perfectly manicured eyebrows furrowing at the exchange. This was Imogen, a social media influencer with millions of followers, known for her advocacy work. She discreetly began recording the interaction on her phone. Sarah settled into her seat, 2A, but Rebecca wasn't finished. Within 5 minutes, she returned. "Excuse me, ma'am," Rebecca's voice cut through the cabin noise. "I need to verify your boarding pass again. We've had some seating confusion lately." A businessman across the aisle frowned. This was the third time the flight attendant had checked Sarah's credentials, while no other first-class passenger had been questioned even once. Imogen, now fully alert to the situation, started a private live stream for her close friends. "Watching something disturbing unfold," she whispered into her phone. "Clear discrimination happening right in front of me." As other passengers boarded, Rebecca made a point of warmly greeting each white passenger in first class, offering to hang their coats and store their luggage. When Sarah requested assistance with her small carry-on, Rebecca's response was curt. "The overhead bins are self-service, ma'am." An elderly white gentleman in the row behind Sarah spoke up. "Excuse me, you just helped me with my bag. Why won't you help this lady?" Rebecca flushed, but quickly composed herself. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm currently attending to other duties." The tension in the cabin was palpable. Imogen had positioned herself to capture every interaction, her social media instincts telling her this situation was escalating beyond typical poor service. "Would you like some water?" Rebecca asked the passengers in first class, deliberately skipping Sarah's row. When Sarah raised her hand to request some, Rebecca pretended not to see her. A middle-aged woman across the aisle noticed and called out, "Excuse me, I believe this lady was trying to get your attention. I'll be with her when I can," Rebecca snapped, her hostile tone shocking several passengers. Emma Chin's fingers flew across her phone's keyboard, documenting clear racial discrimination on Flight 2847. First-class passenger being repeatedly harassed by flight attendant. This is not okay. #discrimination, #racism. Sarah sat quietly, her legal mind already cataloging each interaction, each slight, each violation of airline policy. She'd faced discrimination before, but rarely so blatant, so persistent. Her hands smoothed over her dress, Maria's gift, as if drawing strength from it. More passengers boarded, and the pattern continued. Rebecca found reasons to check Sarah's ticket 2 more times, each verification more aggressive than the last. "We just need to be certain," she would say, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "We can't have people in seats they haven't paid for." Emma Chin's blood was boiling. As an influencer who often spoke about Asian American rights, she recognized the familiar patterns of racial discrimination. She caught Sarah's eye and gave her a supportive nod, which Sarah acknowledged with a gentle smile. The final boarding call came, and Rebecca made one last pass through first class. She stopped at Sarah's row again, this time with a clipboard in hand. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to verify your ticket one final time," Rebecca announced, her voice carrying an edge of triumph. "We seem to have a discrepancy in our seating chart." Before Sarah could respond, a stern voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" It was the flight's purser, Michael Torres, who had noticed the repeated confrontations. Rebecca straightened up, her clipboard clutched to her chest. "Just doing my job, ensuring everyone is in their correct seat." "By checking the same passenger's ticket 6 times? Emma Chin spoke up, her phone still recording. "While ignoring her requests for water and assistance. That's not doing your job, that's harassment." Other passengers began to murmur in agreement. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had become charged with tension, like a courtroom before a crucial verdict. Sarah remained composed, her years on the bench having taught her the power of measured responses. But as she sat there, dignity intact despite Rebecca's attempts to humiliate her, she couldn't help but think that this flight was about to become much more than a simple journey to San Francisco. The engines roared to life, and as the plane prepared for takeoff, the tension in first class continued to simmer. Emma Chin kept her phone ready, Rebecca maintained her hostile vigilance, and Sarah Mitchell, Supreme Court Justice, sat quietly in her designer dress, unaware that the worst was yet to come. The dinner service was in full swing when Rebecca approached Sarah's row again, her movements deliberately slow and precise. The red wine in her hand swayed dangerously as she leaned over, a calculated gleam in her eyes that Sarah had seen too many times before. "Oh!" Rebecca's exclamation of surprise sounded rehearsed as the wine tumbled from her hand, splashing across Sarah's expensive dress. The deep red liquid spread quickly across the midnight blue fabric, creating an ugly stain that seemed to mock Maria's generous gift. "I'm so terribly sorry," Rebecca said, her voice dripping with false concern. "These turbulent flights, you know how it is." But her smirk told a different story. Sarah took a deep breath, reaching for the napkins. "It's fine," she said quietly, though her heart was racing. The businessman beside her immediately offered his handkerchief, his face showing genuine concern. "I should help you clean that up," Rebecca insisted, following Sarah as she made her way to the bathroom. Emma Chin, the young influencer, watched the situation unfold with growing alarm, her phone discreetly recording. In the confined space of the airplane bathroom, Sarah dabbed at her dress, trying to salvage what she could. The door suddenly opened. Rebecca had followed her in. "Let me help," Rebecca said, reaching for Sarah's dress with paper towels. But instead of helping, she grabbed the shoulder of the dress, pulling hard. The sound of tearing fabric filled the small space as the dress ripped from shoulder to chest. Sarah gasped, instinctively trying to cover herself as the torn dress exposed far more than was decent. The humiliation burned hot on her face as Rebecca stood there, a look of mock innocence plastered across her features. "Oh dear," Rebecca said, her voice sickeningly sweet. "Your dress seems to have torn. How unfortunate." Outside, Emma Chun had witnessed Rebecca following Sarah into the bathroom. When Sarah emerged, clutching her jacket around her torn dress, Emma immediately understood what had happened. Her phone was already recording as she stood up. "This is assault," Emma declared loudly, her voice carrying through the cabin. "I saw everything. You followed her into the bathroom and deliberately damaged her clothing." Other passengers began to react. An elderly woman in first class stood up, her face flushed with anger. "This is absolutely disgraceful. How dare you treat another human being this way?" Several male passengers rose from their seats, one of them calling out, "Someone needs to call the police. This is harassment." Sarah stood quietly, her legal mind cataloging every detail even as she fought to maintain her composure. The torn dress felt like a physical representation of the dignity Rebecca had tried to strip from her. Michael Torres, the head flight attendant, rushed forward, his face grave as he took in the scene. "What's going on here?" he demanded, looking between Rebecca's defiant expression and Sarah's torn dress. "This flight attendant has been harassing this passenger since takeoff," Emma explained, her phone still recording. "She deliberately spilled wine on her dress, followed her to the bathroom, and then physically assaulted her by tearing her clothing." The cabin erupted in angry murmurs. A businessman in the front row was already on his phone, presumably calling the airline's customer service. Another passenger was demanding Rebecca's employee number. "She doesn't belong in first class," Rebecca suddenly burst out, her professional mask cracking completely. "Look at her, trying to act like she belongs here with that expensive dress. I was just putting her in her place." The racist undertones of her statement hung in the air like poison, causing several passengers to gasp in shock. Michael Torres's face hardened as he immediately stepped between Rebecca and Sarah. "Rebecca, you need to return to the galley immediately," he ordered, his voice stern. "This is completely unacceptable behavior." Sarah finally spoke, her voice steady despite the humiliation she felt. "I would like to file a formal complaint," she said, each word measured and clear. "And I want it noted that this attack appears to be racially motivated." Emma stepped forward, her phone still recording. "I have everything on video," she announced, including her earlier harassment and this confession. "This isn't just bad service, this is a hate crime." The elderly woman who had spoken up earlier approached Sarah with a spare cardigan. "Here, dear," she said softly. "You shouldn't have to use your jacket." As Sarah accepted the cardigan, she caught her reflection in the bathroom door's mirror. Despite the torn dress, despite the wine stain, despite Rebecca's attempts to humiliate her, she stood tall. Years of facing discrimination had taught her that dignity wasn't in what you wore, but in how you carried yourself. Michael Torres was now on the plane's phone, presumably speaking with ground control. Rebecca had retreated to the galley, but her earlier outburst had revealed her true colors to everyone on board. "The airline will be notified immediately," Torres announced to the cabin, "and I want to assure all passengers that this kind of behavior is not representative of our airline's values." Emma Chun had moved closer to Sarah, her young face determined. "I'm posting this right now," she said quietly. "People need to see what happened here. This isn't right." Sarah looked around the cabin at the faces of her fellow passengers, some angry, some sympathetic, all shocked by what they had witnessed. In her years on the Supreme Court, she had heard countless cases about discrimination, but experiencing it so blatantly, so violently, brought a new perspective to every decision she had ever made. The incident had transformed the first-class cabin into an impromptu courtroom, with passengers serving as witnesses, Emma's phone as evidence, and public opinion already delivering its verdict. But Sarah knew that true justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about change, about making sure such incidents wouldn't happen to someone else. As she sat back in her seat, now wearing the borrowed cardigan over her torn dress, Sarah felt the weight of her position more than ever. Tomorrow, she would return to her role as Supreme Court Justice, but tonight, she was a stark reminder that no amount of success, no prestigious position, could fully shield anyone from the ugly reality of racism. The flight continued, but the atmosphere in the cabin had changed dramatically. Rebecca remained hidden in the galley, while other flight attendants worked double time to attend to passengers, their faces showing embarrassment for their colleagues' actions. Sarah sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, thinking about how this incident would affect not just her, but every person who witnessed it. Sometimes, she realized, the most powerful lessons about justice came not from law books or court decisions, but from moments like these, raw, real, and impossible to ignore. The cabin had descended into chaos. Sarah Mitchell sat in her torn dress, trying desperately to maintain her composure as tears threatened to spill from her eyes. The borrowed cardigan barely covered the damage Rebecca had inflicted, and the humiliation burned deep in her chest. Emma Chin's fingers flew across her phone screen as she started a live stream. "I'm witnessing something absolutely horrific on Flight 2847, she narrated, her voice trembling with anger. A flight attendant has just assaulted a passenger, deliberately ripping her dress in what appears to be a racially motivated attack. Around the cabin, passengers were pulling out their phones. Some were dialing the airline's customer service number, while others were recording the aftermath of the incident. The businessman who had been sitting next to Sarah was practically shouting into his phone. "This is completely unacceptable," he demanded. "Your employee just physically assaulted a passenger. Yes, I want to speak to a supervisor immediately." Sarah's hands shook as she tried to adjust the cardigan, fighting back tears that refused to be contained. Years of maintaining judicial composure crumbled in the face of such public humiliation. A single tear rolled down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away, but not before several passengers noticed. Emma, still live streaming, suddenly gasped. Her eyes widened as she scrolled through her phone. "Oh my God," she whispered, then louder. "Oh my God, does everyone realize who this passenger is?" The cabin grew quiet as Emma stood up, her voice shaking with a mixture of awe and anger. "This woman is Supreme Court Justice Sarah Mitchell. Rebecca Watson just assaulted a Supreme Court justice." The revelation hit the cabin like a thunderbolt. Passengers who had been angry before were now absolutely livid. The elderly woman who had lent Sarah her cardigan covered her mouth in shock. "A Supreme Court justice?" someone exclaimed. "This is going to be a national scandal." Rebecca, who had been hovering near the galley, turned pale. Her face drained of all color as the implications of her actions began to sink in. But then, something unexpected happened. Her expression shifted from fear to a strange mix of recognition and bitter satisfaction. "Mitchell?" Rebecca's voice carried across the cabin, suddenly sharp with recognition. "Sarah Mitchell? You're the one who ruled on the Davidson Industries case last year?" Sarah's head snapped up, her judicial instincts kicking in despite her distress. The Davidson Industries case, a landmark decision about workplace discrimination that had made headlines. "My brother lost everything because of you." Rebecca's voice rose, cracking with emotion. "Your ruling shut down the entire company. 3 generations of my family worked there, and you destroyed it all with one signature." The truth crashed over the cabin like a wave. This hadn't been just random discrimination. It had been targeted revenge. Passengers exchanged shocked glances as the full story began to unfold. So this was premeditated? Emma's livestream captured everything. You deliberately targeted her because of a legal ruling? Rebecca's face contorted with rage and desperation. "That company was our life. My brother couldn't find work for months. His wife left him. All because her justice decided we were discriminating against workers." Sarah finally found her voice, steady despite her tears. The evidence in that case was clear. Davidson Industries had a documented history of discriminatory practices spanning decades. "Clear to you, maybe?" Rebecca shot back. "You sit in your fancy robes making decisions about people's lives without ever thinking about the consequences." The irony of Rebecca's words, her own discriminatory actions proving exactly why the Davidson ruling had been necessary, wasn't lost on anyone in the cabin. Michael Torres, the head flight attendant, stepped forward. "Rebecca, that's enough. Go to the back alley now." But the damage was done. Passengers were now recording everything, their phones capturing every word of Rebecca's confession. The revelation of Sarah's identity, combined with the discovery of Rebecca's personal vendetta, had transformed the incident from a case of discrimination into something far more serious. "This is a federal crime," the businessman stated firmly. "Attacking a Supreme Court justice, that's not just assault, that's a direct attack on the judiciary." Emma's livestream comments were exploding. "Justice Mitchell, we stand with you. This is absolutely disgusting. She needs to be arrested when we land." Sarah sat quietly, her legal mind already processing the implications. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the integrity of the judicial system, about the safety of judges to carry out their duties without fear of retaliation. The elderly woman beside her squeezed her hand. "My dear, you've shown such grace under pressure. But please don't let her get away with this. Some actions must have consequences." As if on cue, the pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to an incident on board, we will be met at the gate by airport police and airline representatives. Please remain seated until we've come to a complete stop." Rebecca, still standing in the galley, seemed to deflate as the announcement was made. The reality of her actions, and their consequences, finally appeared to hit her. Her face crumpled, but no one in the cabin felt sympathy. Her tears now seemed hollow compared to the dignity with which Sarah had handled the assault. Sarah straightened in her seat, her judicial demeanor slowly returning. She had spent her career fighting for justice, ensuring that actions had consequences. Now, ironically, she found herself at the center of a case that would test those very principles. The cabin remained tense for the rest of the flight, passengers alternating between checking on Sarah and glaring at Rebecca. Emma's livestream continued to gather viewers, the story spreading across social media like wildfire. As the plane began its descent, Sarah thought about the Davidson case, about all the workers who had suffered discrimination at that company. She thought about Rebecca's brother, about how hatred and prejudice could poison entire families. Most of all, she thought about justice, not just the kind dispensed from a bench, but the kind that happens in everyday moments, when people choose between right and wrong. The plane's wheels touched down, carrying with it a story that would soon make headlines across the nation. But for Sarah Mitchell, Supreme Court Justice, this was more than just another news story. It was a reminder that the fight for justice never ends. It just takes different forms at different altitudes. The plane began its final descent into San Francisco International Airport, but the atmosphere in first class remained charged with tension. Sarah Mitchell stood, her torn dress partially concealed by the borrowed cardigan, and addressed the cabin with the quiet authority that had made her one of the most respected voices on the Supreme Court. "My name is Justice Sarah Mitchell of the United States Supreme Court," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin. "What has happened here today goes beyond poor service or personal prejudice. This was a targeted assault motivated by racial bias." Rebecca, who had been hovering near the galley, went pale. The color drained from her face as the full implications of her actions crashed over her. She had assaulted a Supreme Court justice, one of the highest-ranking officials in the American judicial system. I didn't know," she stammered, her earlier bravado completely evaporated. "If I had known who you were." "That's precisely the problem," Sarah cut her off, her voice firm but measured. "My title shouldn't determine how I'm treated. No passenger should endure what I've experienced today." Emma Chin's livestream viewers had exploded into the thousands. "Justice Mitchell has just revealed her identity," she narrated, her phone steady as she captured the scene. "The flight attendant who assaulted her is facing the consequences of her actions in real time." Michael Torres was already on the plane's phone, his voice urgent. "Yes, sir. Supreme Court Justice Mitchell? Yes. Physical assault and racial discrimination. We'll need law enforcement at the gate." The CEO of the airline had been immediately notified, and word spread quickly through the company's hierarchy. By the time the plane touched down, a crisis management team was already assembled at the gate. As the aircraft taxied to its position, Rebecca sat crumpled in the jump seat, tears streaming down her face. But Sarah noticed they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of fear, of realizing the magnitude of her mistake. "The police will be waiting," Michael informed the cabin. "I ask that all passengers remain seated until law enforcement boards." When the aircraft door opened, 2 San Francisco Police Department officers stepped aboard, followed by the airline's regional director and a grim-faced PR representative. "Justice Mitchell," the lead officer said, approaching with respect, "we've been briefed on the situation. Would you like to press charges?" Sarah stood, every inch the Supreme Court justice despite her torn dress. Yes, she said firmly, not just for myself, but for every passenger who has ever faced discrimination and stayed silent out of fear or resignation. Rebecca was led off the plane in handcuffs, her uniform no longer carrying any authority. As she passed Sarah's row, she tried one last time to explain. Justice Mitchell, please. I have a family, a mortgage. So do many of the people who face discrimination every day, Sarah replied calmly. Perhaps this will be an opportunity for reflection and growth. The airline's regional director stepped forward, his face ashen. Justice Mitchell, on behalf of the entire airline, I want to express our deepest apologies. Ms. Watson's employment has been terminated, effective immediately. Emma's livestream captured everything. Breaking news. Flight attendant arrested for assaulting Supreme Court justice in racially motivated attack. This is no longer just a viral moment. This is history. As passengers deplaned, many stopped to express their support. The elderly woman who had lent Sarah her cardigan touched her arm gently. You've done something important here today, Justice Mitchell. You've shown that no one is above the law, and no one is beneath its protection. News vans were already gathering outside the terminal. The story was spreading like wildfire across social media and news networks. Supreme Court justice assaulted on flight in racist attack, airline under fire as flight attendant arrested. Justice Mitchell takes stand against discrimination at 30,000 feet. Sarah moved through the terminal with quiet dignity, flanked by airport security and airline officials. Reporters called out questions, cameras flashed, but she maintained her composure. This wasn't about media attention or personal vengeance. It was about justice. The airline CEO had already issued a statement. We are horrified by the treatment Justice Mitchell received on our flight. This incident has revealed serious gaps in our training and culture that we are committed to addressing immediately. We have terminated the employee responsible and are cooperating fully with law enforcement. In the airport's VIP lounge, Sarah finally had a moment to process the events. Emma Chin approached her respectfully. Justice Mitchell, my followers are asking if they can share the video. They want people to see what happened. Sarah considered for a moment. Yes, she decided. Sometimes we need to see injustice clearly to understand why we must fight it. But please emphasize that this isn't about punishing one person. It's about changing a system that allows such behavior to exist. Her phone buzzed with messages from her fellow Supreme Court justices, offering support and expressing outrage. Her clerk had already begun researching similar cases of discrimination in air travel, preparing for the inevitable legal discussions that would follow. As she finally left the airport, Sarah thought about the dress, now ruined, that Maria had given her. Perhaps its destruction would serve a greater purpose, a tangible reminder that the fight for justice and equality was far from over, even for those who had reached the highest levels of power. The next morning's headlines told the story. Supreme Court Justice's torn dress becomes symbol of ongoing fight against discrimination. Airline faces backlash after racist attack on Justice Mitchell. Flight attendant charged with assault and civil rights violations. But for Sarah, the most important headline was yet to be written. The one that would come from lasting change in how people treated each other, not just in the air, but everywhere. As she prepared for her next court session, she knew that this experience would inform her decisions in ways that law books never could. Justice, she had been reminded, wasn't just about the law. It was about dignity, respect, and the courage to stand up when those values were threatened, whether in a courtroom or at 30,000 feet. In the days following the flight incident, the story exploded across national media. Emma Chin's video, which had already gone viral on social media, was now being featured on major news networks. The footage showed, in stark detail, the progression of Rebecca's discriminatory behavior, culminating in the dramatic revelation of Justice Mitchell's identity. Flight attendant faces charges for assaulting Supreme Court justice, blazed across headlines. News anchors debated the implications, legal experts weighed in, and social media erupted with calls for justice. Sarah Mitchell sat in her chambers, watching the story unfold on multiple screens. Her clerk, David, had compiled a thick folder of press coverage and public reactions. The civil rights organizations are requesting to file amicus briefs, David reported, his voice tight with concern. They're arguing this case represents a broader pattern of discrimination in the airline industry. Sarah nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of her desk. And Rebecca? She's been formally charged with assault and civil rights violations, David replied. The airline terminated her employment immediately after landing, and the prosecutors are treating this as a high-priority case. The security footage from the plane, combined with Emma's video and multiple witness statements, had created an airtight case. The businessman who had sat next to Sarah had already provided a detailed affidavit, as had the elderly woman with the cardigan. Emma Chin's social media following had exploded overnight. Her livestream had been viewed millions of times, and she was now being hailed as a hero for documenting the incident. She had appeared on several morning shows, speaking passionately about the importance of standing up against discrimination. "What happened to Justice Mitchell happens to people of color every day," Emma said during one interview. "The only difference is that most victims don't have the power of a Supreme Court justice's title to protect them." Rebecca Watson's face had become synonymous with racial prejudice. Her tearful apology, captured on airport security cameras, did little to stem the tide of public outrage. Civil rights organizations pointed to her behavior as evidence of systemic racism in the service industry. Sarah watched as protesters gathered outside the airline's headquarters, carrying signs that read, "Justice for Justice Mitchell" and "End Discrimination in the Skies." The irony wasn't lost on her. In her office, Sarah prepared for her testimony. The prosecution had built a strong case, but she insisted on approaching it with the same measured consideration she brought to her own courtroom. "Your Honor," her legal advisor began, "the defense is likely to argue that Ms. Watson's actions were motivated by personal grievance over the Davidson Industries case, not racial bias." "The two aren't mutually exclusive," Sarah replied, thinking of how quickly Rebecca had jumped to racial stereotypes when confronting her. "In fact, they often reinforce each other." The preliminary hearing was set for the following week. The courthouse steps were already crowded with reporters and activists. Inside, Sarah took her seat in the witness box, feeling the strange displacement of being on this side of the judicial process. Rebecca sat at the defense table, looking small in her civilian clothes. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her shoulders hunched under the weight of public scrutiny. When Sarah began her testimony, her voice carried the same measured tone she used in her own courtroom. "Ms. Watson's actions escalated from subtle discrimination to physical assault," she stated clearly. "The torn dress was not just about damaged clothing. It was an attempt to strip away dignity and humanity." The prosecution presented Emma's video, and the courtroom watched in silence as the events unfolded on screen. Several jurors visibly reacted to the moment when Rebecca deliberately tore Sarah's dress. Civil rights leaders packed the gallery, taking notes and occasionally shaking their heads at particularly egregious moments. This case had become more than just about one incident. It had become a symbol of the ongoing struggle against discrimination. Outside the courthouse, supporters held vigils. Many shared their own stories of discrimination, finding courage in Sarah's willingness to stand up and seek justice. The case had sparked a national conversation about privilege, power, and the everyday indignities faced by people of color. The airline industry faced its own reckoning. Other carriers rushed to announce new training programs and diversity initiatives. Sarah's suggestion about comprehensive sensitivity training had sparked an industry-wide movement for reform. Emma Chin used her expanded platform to continue advocating for change. She started a hashtag campaign, #FlightJustice, encouraging others to share their experiences of discrimination during air travel. The response was overwhelming. "What happened to Justice Mitchell was caught on camera," Emma said during a panel discussion. "But how many similar incidents go undocumented? How many voices go unheard?" As the legal proceedings continued, Sarah maintained her dignity and composure. She insisted that the case focus not just on punishment, but on education and reform. Her testimony emphasized the systemic nature of discrimination and the importance of addressing its root causes. "The goal isn't to destroy Ms. Watson's life," she told reporters outside the courthouse. "The goal is to ensure that no one else faces similar treatment, regardless of their title or position." Rebecca's defense team attempted to paint her actions as an isolated incident driven by personal grievance, but the evidence of racial bias was overwhelming. The jury watched as the video showed her treating other first-class passengers with respect while singling out Sarah for harassment. The verdict, when it came, was swift and decisive. Rebecca was found guilty on all counts. The judge, acknowledging the unique nature of the case, included mandatory anti-bias training and community service as part of the sentence. Sarah's dress, still bearing the water stain and torn shoulder, was preserved as evidence. Museums and civil rights organizations requested to display it as a symbol of the ongoing fight against discrimination. Sarah eventually donated it to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, where it would stand as a reminder that justice sometimes wore unexpected faces. The case became required reading in law schools, not just for its legal implications, but for its powerful message about the intersection of personal dignity and systemic discrimination. Sarah received invitations to speak at universities and organizations across the country, sharing her experience and insights. Emma Chen's documentation of the incident was studied in journalism schools as an example of the power of citizen journalism in the fight for social justice. Her quick thinking and courage in recording the events had helped ensure that justice was served. As the media frenzy began to fade, Sarah returned to her chambers, carrying with her a deeper understanding of the cases that came before her. The experience had changed her perspective, making the legal principles she upheld feel more personal, more urgent. The airline industry implemented new training programs, with Sarah's case serving as a powerful teaching tool. Flight attendants learned about unconscious bias and the importance of treating all passengers with equal respect and dignity. Rebecca Watson's story became a cautionary tale, but also a reminder that prejudice often masked itself behind professional facades and personal grievances. Her sentence included speaking to airline employees about her actions and their consequences, turning her experience into a lesson for others. The elderly woman who had lent Sarah her cardigan sent her a letter. "Your grace under pressure taught us all something about dignity and justice. Thank you for showing us how to stand up for what's right." As Sarah prepared for her next court session, she glanced at the framed photo on her desk, herself in her judicial robes, standing proud and tall. The incident had reminded her that justice wasn't just about legal precedents and careful arguments. Sometimes it was about standing firm in the face of prejudice, about turning moments of discrimination into opportunities for change. The case of the torn dress had become more than just a legal matter. It had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that justice could prevail, even at 30,000 feet. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and activists as Sarah Mitchell made her way inside for Rebecca Watson's hearing. 3 months had passed since that fateful flight, but the impact of the incident had only grown stronger with time. Emma Chen's video had gone viral, sparking a national conversation about discrimination in the service industry. Sarah smoothed down her judicial robes, different from the torn dress that had become a symbol of resistance. That dress now sat in a museum display, a powerful reminder of how prejudice could manifest in unexpected places. Inside the courtroom, Rebecca Watson sat with her attorney, looking diminished in her civilian clothes. The arrogance that had fueled her actions on the flight was gone, replaced by the sobering reality of consequences. The judge, Ana Maria Rodriguez, called the court to order. In the matter of the United States versus Rebecca Watson, on charges of assault and civil rights violations, Judge Rodriguez began, her voice carrying through the hushed courtroom. The prosecution presented their case methodically, playing Emma's video footage. The courtroom watched in silence as the events unfolded on screen. The deliberate wine spill, the torn dress, the escalating harassment. Rebecca's face grew paler with each moment. When it was Sarah's turn to testify, she spoke with measured clarity. "This case isn't about revenge," she stated. "It's about accountability and the need for systemic change." Ms. Watson's actions weren't isolated. They were symptomatic of deeper prejudices that must be addressed. The defense tried to argue for leniency, citing Rebecca's clean record and the stress of her brother's situation after the Davidson Industries ruling. But Judge Rodriguez was unmoved. "Ms. Watson," she declared, "your actions were not just an assault on Justice Mitchell. They were an attack on the principles of equality our justice system strives to uphold. The court sentences you to 2 years probation, mandatory anti-bias training, and 1,000 hours of community service with civil rights organizations. Additionally, You are barred from working in the commercial aviation industry for 5 years. The airline industry responded swiftly to the verdict. Major carriers announced comprehensive diversity training programs and new anti-discrimination policies. The incident had forced them to confront long-ignored issues within their corporate culture. Sarah's experience became a catalyst for change. Congress began drafting new legislation strengthening protections against discrimination in public accommodations. The Mitchell Act would specifically address bias in the transportation sector. Emma Chin, whose quick thinking had documented the incident, became an influential voice in social justice circles. Her following grew as she continued to highlight similar cases of discrimination. What happened to Justice Mitchell wasn't unique, Emma said during a television interview. The only unique thing was that it was caught on camera and happened to someone with the power to fight back. How many others faced this treatment silently? The elderly woman who had offered Sarah her cardigan that day testified before a congressional committee, her voice trembling with emotion as she described decades of witnessing similar incidents and staying silent. "Never again," she declared. "We must all speak up." Sarah continued her work on the Supreme Court, but her perspective had shifted. Each case involving discrimination now carried the weight of personal experience. Her opinions became even more powerful, informed by the reality of prejudice she had faced firsthand. In her chambers, Sarah kept a small photo of herself in the torn dress, a reminder that justice wasn't just about legal precedents. It was about human dignity and the courage to stand up for what's right. The airline CEO personally implemented a scholarship program for minority students pursuing careers in aviation, naming it after Sarah. "We must turn this moment of shame into an opportunity for progress," he announced at the program's launch. Rebecca Watson, through her mandated community service, began to understand the depth of her actions. Working with civil rights organizations opened her eyes to the systemic nature of discrimination she had perpetuated. "I can't undo what I did," Rebecca said during a required speaking engagement about bias awareness. "But I can help others recognize and change their own prejudices before they cause harm." As Sarah prepared for another day on the bench, she reflected on how one flight had sparked a movement for change. The torn dress had become more than just damaged clothing. It was now a symbol of resistance against discrimination, a reminder that justice could prevail even at 30,000 feet. "Sometimes," she told a graduating class of law students, "the most important cases aren't the ones we hear in court, but the ones we live through." Each of us has the power and responsibility to stand up for justice, wherever we find ourselves. The incident had transformed not just policies and laws, but hearts and minds. It had shown that change was possible, that accountability mattered, and that dignity was a right worth fighting for. In every courtroom, every workplace, and every airplane cabin across America.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.